I don't understand what you want trans people to do. I remember growing up in like elementary school and having that one kid in class whose body didn't seem to match his behavior in our eyes, and how they were never spared a single second of humiliation, threats, bullying. Teachers wouldn't step up for them when they saw this sort of stuff happening. If another kid stood up for them, they were bullied too. There are people right now who will say that if their kid was trans, they would kick them out, they would disown them, they'd never speak to them again. And that's an uncontroversial statement. So what do y'all want trans people to do? Because to see someone get bullied, harassed, and threatened, told that they were too feminine, that they'd never be a man, only to transition and be told that they could never be a woman, makes it seem like you don't want them to be. I understand that the whole concept makes you uncomfortable. I was socialized in the same world that you were. But there are people who are going through something that you don't understand, and I don't understand it either. But it's not for me to understand. It's enough for me to know that there are people who've been subject to harm their entire lives just for trying to be the most authentic version of themselves in ways that I've taken for granted my entire life. So it's not too much for me to stand in solidarity with them or support them or to applaud them when they break barriers, because it's taken an immense amount of courage just to be here. Maybe that's too much to ask of you, so I'll suggest a bare minimum. Just don't go out of your way to try to make their days worse, because it took more energy from you to show your hatred than to just be quiet.
If God is dead, everything is permitted.
Well, on the contrary, that assumes that human beings have no feeling about what is right and wrong. Is the only reason you are virtuous because that's your ticket to heaven? Is the only reason you don't put your children to death because you don't want to go to hell? It seems to me that it's insulting to human beings to imply that only a system of rewards and punishments can keep you a decent human being. Isn't it conceivable a person wants to be a decent human being because that way he feels better, because that way the world is better? I don't believe that I'm ever going to heaven or hell. When I die, there will be nothingness. That does not mean that I have the impulse to go out and rob and steal and rape and everything else because I don't fear punishment. For one thing, I fear worldly punishment. And for a second thing, I fear the punishment of my own conscience. I have a conscience. It doesn't depend on religion. And I think it's so with other people too. Besides, even in societies in which religion is very powerful, there's no shortage of crime and sin and misery and terrible things happening despite heaven and hell.
Love of mine, someday you will die, but I'll be close behind. I'll follow you into the dark, no winding line or tunnel to gates of wine. The door hands clap so tight, waiting for another spark. If heaven and hell decide that they both are satisfied, illuminate the nose on their vacancy sign. If there's no one beside you when your soul is hard, I'll follow you into the dark. Is it too short?
Well, we'll just put this part in the video.
Okay, perfect.
And then it'll be long enough.
Great. I love that song. Cass.
Well, we've got a new drip. The good news is it's going straight into the toilet. The bad news is
working on my potato towers. Already got one finished. That was my baby red potatoes. So right here's gonna be my Yukon Golds. Just got 2x4 welded wire with a T-post. Got the wire wrapped together. Layer of straw, your dirt, potatoes, another layer of dirt over top of it. Straw over top. Kind of make like a little hole in the straw, fold it up on the sides. And you put your dirt in there, roll of potatoes, dirt, another layer of straw all the way up to the top. Then the flowers of potatoes grow out the sides. Then when you're ready, you just come up, cut the wire, undo where they're tied together, and there's your potatoes.
You know the crab like money, know the sponge like fun, know the star keeps shining, know the squid likes guns. What we all got in common when this shit's said and done, it's a dead fucking roach and a city that we run. I just popped a bean, watch my eyes grow, sipping hella lean, smoking hydro. When I hit the reef, turn it tidal. Gary is my shadow, bitch, he go wherever I go. Meow, meow, meow. Gary hit him with the meow, meow, meow. Gary hit him with the meow, meow, meow. Gary hit him with the.
Where do non-binary people come from?
Dunno.
It all starts in Mesopotamia.
When was that?
2000 BC.
2000 BC.
This civilization was the earliest records of humanity. There are references to types of people who are neither male or female, and the records describe how God created these people, their roles in society, and words for different kinds of them. At the same time, let's skip over to ancient Egypt, shall we? Who also described 3 genders: male, female, and Sekhet. Let's spin the globe one more time, shall we? And we'll go to Southern Asia.
Is this around the same sort of time?
This was actually a little bit later. This was around 400 BC. There are the earliest records of the Hijra people. The Hijra can consider themselves to be neither male or female.
As a whole entire civilization?
Yeah, and they still exist, the Hijra people, although oppressed they are. Next, we have 7th century BC. These are my favourites. The Scythians, who were Eurasian nomadic horse riders. who apparently...
You're making this up.
who apparently honoured gender non-conforming people as priests and warriors. They apparently also invented the earliest known hormone therapy using licorice root.
Wow, just get me licorice root out.
Pre-colonial Native Americans, let's spin that bloody globe again, shall we? Who historically recognised various kinds of genders that all fall under the umbrella of Two-Spirit, which just encompasses the different kinds of genders that they had in the communities that don't fit in the Western gender binary. Now, post-Christ, 1st century, the year 100, there are records stating that classical Judaism actually recognised 6 genders. I can't tell you more information about that because I don't know it. Anglo-Saxon, when did they start recognising non-binary people? The roots of you and I, the British. Because in the 11th century, there was a word found called weapon withestra, which meant woman with a weapon, which also people believed to be woman with a penis, and may have been a word used to describe queer, intersex, non-binary folk back in the 11th century of Britain.
So it's not a new thing at all.
It's ancient. It's ancient, baby. It goes as far back as time as we know.
I'm tired of having goals. I'm sick of improving personally and professionally. Accomplishing anything is massively overrated. I'm exhausted of being held to any standard whatsoever. I'm at peace with never reaching full optimization. I'm ready to retire after accomplishing almost nothing and saving very little. I don't want to hit metrics or milestones. I don't want to look back at how far I've come. I don't want to overcome adversity and emerge as a better person. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and I don't want to take it. I want to aimlessly meander until I wander off a cliff. I want to lay down in the forest and be slowly consumed by vines. I want to murder my calendar and leap into a sinkhole. Learning and growing sucks. This is who I am. Any improvement is purely accidental. I'm being pulverized by the crushing weight of daily structure. Life is chaos, and so many things are outside of my control. No thing brings me happiness. It only comes from within. We're here on Earth to fart around. Don't let anybody tell you different.
Well, I went walking past vacant apartments, across the highway, under a sea of full tents. I didn't have cash then for a man who was asking, is this land made for you and me? This land ain't my land, is it your land? I didn't do nothing more than that poor man, and we both wander under freedom's highway. Is this land made for you and me?
I had a really good conversation in therapy today, by which I mean I called my best friend because I need to find a new therapist. I was like, I really need to get off my ass and do the work that I've been procrastinating since last Wednesday. And she was like, is it procrastinating? Or have you been processing a national crisis? I was like, no, I'm not processing anything. I'm shitposting memes and crocheting late Christmas presents, including yours. She was like, but that's how you process things. What? I'm sorry, you mean to tell me when I take one or multiple mental health hours, I'm not actually required to be like doubled over and sobbing? Like if I do things that I enjoy during emergency break, that's actually fine and not cheating? You don't owe anyone a performance of grief during your personal time. Fuck. Yes, ladies and everyone, today is the day that clicked for me.
Oh, one of these doesn't have a name on it. Guys, none of the quizzes have names on them. Our bet's locked in. Yeah, I think we're good. What's going on? Social experiment. Some of us have money on how you'll play this. We're acting en masse. Your authority's no good here. This is ridiculous. You cannot do this on a quiz. Does that count as ineffectual grandstanding? I mean, it's all multiple choice, so there's no handwriting to analyze. Pretty lazy test design on your part. Could just make you all retake it. Could. That'd take a whole day of class and would get misaligned with the other sections. Nightmarish. I don't know. Score them all and give everybody the average? Median. I don't trust some of these people. Could just give you all a 0. Yeah, no bets on that one. You don't have the spine. Well, you basically know how each of us will do on a given quiz, so the real temptation is distribute the quizzes based on who usually does well. Yeah. Protect the status quo to protect yourself. Just would feel like it would confirm that you only see us within an academic hierarchy despite all the rhetoric to the contrary. It's the layer right beneath this one that I really don't want to countenance. Our human and academic identities aren't wholly separable to you. Schools rob us of personhood every day. We are a stack of anonymous quizzes, names and scores to be matched. What are you but a foot soldier for that anonymizing principle? I suppose I could just distribute the scores randomly then, as like an admission of guilt. Subvert the hierarchy in favor of some chaos, but if the scores are random and the names are random, then you guys, I am so sorry. Should have known he'd get all about all of this. You have a Venmo? Oh, yeah. Hey, no phones in class.
I have some financial advice. Would anyone like to hear it?
No, thank you. I already heard it.
It's too late for me. If you've already heard my tips and tricks, how come people under 40 have less than 7% of household wealth in the United States?
Recessions, global crises, anyway, stagnant wages, corporate tax cuts, ballooning education costs, ballooning housing costs, ballooning food costs. You're saying no one wants to work anymore.
I did not say that. I actually have 2 jobs, but I don't want to work either of them. Are you spending more than 30% of your income on rent?
You're assuming I rent?
Yes. Okay, correct. I do rent, and I absolutely spend more than 30% of my income on it, definitely. I'm sorry, did you say 30% or 50%? Either way, I spend more. That's your problem. I do agree that it's a problem. How much are you putting in savings?
You mean my emergency fund?
I am not. You're not saving money? I have to use it all to live.
800-588-2300 Empire. You wanna know if the drapes they match the carpet? He looking like you wanna scarf it, better cool it, darn it. Yes, I'm a harlot, but I keep the pussy guarded. I've seen too much, I've been too far, that shit has got me hearted. And I'm black out beige, so let's get it started. Bump it up, I dump my guts out with a Sharpie marker. Empire smaller than a New York City apartment. I some murder for the art until I'm there to party.
We're gonna go to the whole world, here's us. So I'm currently doing the lit review for my PhD, and I'm studying feminism, misogyny, and networked activism. And so I'm having to kind of like think a lot about the work that I do on TikTok and my own feminist beliefs and what I think the real role of feminism is today. And what I've realised is that the main battle that feminists should be fighting now is against capitalism and the impact of capitalism on women globally. I've just finished reading this book, which I highly recommend. But one area of that book that really piqued my interest was domestic labour, and just how important it is that domestic labour is not properly compensated or recognised in a functioning capitalist society. And if that sounds backwards, it's because it is. The whole capitalist model operates on the premise that there's a few people at the top that make profit off of the vast majority of people beneath them working harder for less money. People work harder than they need to, and that surplus labour is the profit for the business. So capitalism loves surplus and it loves free work. And what is some of the greatest free work that's done in our society? Childcare, child rearing, childbirth. Having children is essential to the sustenance of any society, but in capitalism, they're not just people that are continuing the next generation, they're the next generation of workers, most importantly. And reproductive labour, i.e. the work that goes into reproducing yourselves to create another generation of workers, is disproportionately undertaken by women. Obviously, you've got the physical element of like women actually being the ones to give birth and breastfeed and things like that, but you also have the fact that for a very privileged group of women like myself, you know, if we want to then contribute successfully to a capitalist society, the best thing we can do is outsource a lot of the caring labour, i.e., you know, the raising of the kids and the looking after of the kids, to another woman who is less privileged, so that we can go off and have our high-flying jobs and careers, and this other woman can look after our children for us, so that we can go and have nice lives. And then the chain continues until you get to less and less privileged women. Under a capitalist society, the best model we can be offered as women is one which shifts all of the reproductive labour off to less privileged women so that we can enter a level playing field with the men and try and compete for that top tier privileged job, economic, social security. And that's why this whole you can have it all pseudo-feminist narrative is really toxic, because it's only accessible to an extremely privileged few. Most women still will struggle to actually make it to the top in their workplaces anyway, because productive labour and reproductive labour is still inherently gendered in our society. So there's still a broken rung on the career ladder for women getting up to management level. Women still have to work a second shift at home. And all that undervalued work goes to creating the ultimate commodity, the next generation of workers.
So everyone this past week has been talking about how men are always thinking about the Roman Empire and like what's the women's equivalent of the Roman Empire. I'm going to tell you about my Roman Empire. And that is the Austrian wine poisonings of 1985. Let me explain. So back in the 1970s and 80s, the core of the Austrian wine market was exporting sweet wine. The Austrian wine growers would leave the grapes on the vine as long as possible, often not harvesting them till late summer. This means that the grapes were super sweet, which led to super sweet wine. And unlike other countries like France or Italy that had a series of small independent wineries, Austria's wine industry was actually made to mass produce wine. This means that they could export and sell this wine at much cheaper rates. This created a huge market for Austrian sweet wine in West Germany. But by the late 1970s, production of this sweet wine quite literally reached like impossible levels. But the government regulatory bodies that were meant to oversee all of this wine production in Austria was massively underfunded and understaffed. And when I say understaffed, I mean there were 18 inspectors that were meant to oversee over 60,000 wine companies. So the Austrian wine industry basically got to keep going, doing whatever they wanted unchecked. That is until late 1984, at which point a man walked into the Department of Agricultural Chemistry in West Germany. He put a vial of unidentified liquid on the counter and said, "Austrian winemakers are using chemicals to sweeten their wines." At which point he turned around and walked out. To this day, no one knows who this whistleblower was. And then a second anonymous tip came in early 1985. An anonymous insider that worked at one of these Austrian wineries called to report that the owner of the winery was buying huge quantities of unidentified chemicals in bulk with no explanation as to why. So the West German Department of Agricultural Chemistry went and confiscated a bunch of this wine to test it, and they found something that definitely wasn't supposed to be in there. They found that this Austrian sweet wine contained diethylene glycol, a chemical that is most commonly found in brake fluid, paint thinner, and antifreeze. Now obviously, this is not a chemical that is meant for human consumption. When consumed, diethylene glycol can cause renal failure of the kidneys as well as permanent damage to neurons, sometimes leading to paralysis and death. The amount that was initially found in these bottles of wine was not enough to cause acute poisoning. However, if you consumed multiple bottles of this contaminated sweet wine over time, you would still see the same poisoning effects. Now at this point, they had only found it at one winery. Maybe this was just an isolated incident, right? Well, word of the investigation started getting around to the other wineries in Austria, who, spoiler alert, were also using diethylene glycol to sweeten their wines. So they think, oh my god, we have to get rid of this contaminated wine immediately. So they start dumping it into the sewers. But the diethylene glycol in the wine started destroying all of the bacterial colonies in the sewage treatment plants, meaning those bacterial colonies could no longer do their job and break down the sewage, leading to a bunch of raw sewage being pushed out into the rivers in Austria. By trying to hide the fact that they had used diethylene glycol in this wine, they inadvertently tipped off the investigators that this was not isolated to one winery, it was an industry-wide practice. But the question is, why? Why the hell were they putting this chemical into their wines? You see, at the time, these sweet wines would be tested for added sugars. If there was any added sugar detected in the wine, it would be sold at a cheaper price. Diethylene glycol provided the perfect way to get around this, because diethylene glycol was very, very sweet. And it enhanced the full flavor profile of the wine itself. And, most importantly, it was incredibly cheap and easy to buy. And because diethylene glycol was not well studied at that point, there really weren't many tests available for it. Now, West Germany's Department of Agricultural Chemistry had confiscated millions upon millions of liters of this wine. And it took them months to test it all. But in the process, they developed a much more highly sensitive and efficient test for detecting diethylene glycol. And they found diethylene glycol present in bottles of wine as old as 1976, meaning that this practice had been quietly going on for nearly a decade. Now, obviously, this information being discovered sends the Austrian wine industry into a panic. And in that panic, they start pointing fingers. They say, well, we didn't add the diethylene glycol to the wine. It must have been added by the Western German manufacturers after we exported the wine to them. It's all Western Germany's fault, which obviously wasn't true. But just to make sure, investigators started testing sweet wine made in West Germany as well. And guess what? They found diethylene glycol in there too. Because winemakers in Western Germany had quietly started blending the Austrian sweet wine they imported with their own wine in order to enhance its quality. On top of that, Western Germany also started taking all of this Austrian sweet wine that they had imported and just sitting around and just started re-exporting it to countries that weren't aware of the poisoning scandal yet. Because, of course, they didn't want to lose out on making any profits on all of this sweet wine. These other countries eventually caught on to the poisoning scandal and outright banned the import of any Austrian wine. And as if it couldn't get any worse, diethylene glycol started being detected not just in wine, but in plain grape juice. You know, the kind that is given to children. So this investigation has discovered that diethylene glycol is everywhere. But why? Why was there a need to add this chemical to all of these grape products? And the answer is climate change. See, as I mentioned earlier, Austrian wine growers had previously been able to rely on leaving the grapes on the vine as long as possible and not having to harvest them until late summer to make them as sweet as possible. By the mid-1970s, the climate in Austria had started warming up so much that this was no longer possible. The grapes were falling off the vine much earlier in the seasons and yielding much more sour grapes. But regardless, they still had this huge demand for this cheap, sweet wine from Western Germany that they had to continue to fulfill, while also getting around all of these tests for added sugars. The whole concept of using diethylene glycol as a sweetener was traced back to chemist and wine consultant Otto Nadrasky. He tinkered with the chemical, created the formula, and gave it to the wine companies that were paying him to do so. Those companies subsequently sold it to other Austrian wine companies, until it got to the point where 15% of all wine made in Austria contained some amount of diethylene glycol. Now, this scandal caused the Austrian wine industry to pretty much collapse. After the scandal was made public, Austrian wine exports had fallen to 5% of where it had been 1 year prior. Their reputation had been utterly decimated on the international scale. And when all was said and done, Austria had 270 million liters of this contaminated wine that they needed to destroy. They had learned they couldn't dump it into the sewers, so they had to get creative with it. Eventually, some manufacturing plants managed to either burn the wine for electricity or use the wine as coolant for various machines. In response to the scandal, the Austrian government passed some of the strictest quality control laws for wine in the world. Every single bottle of wine that's made in Austria is now tested for quality, and if it passes all of those really strict tests, it gets this really iconic red and white seal of quality. On top of that, the culture of winemaking in Austria also saw a huge shift. The next generation of winemakers were educated to focus on quality over quantity. And even though the Austrian wine market is now much smaller than it was in the 70s and 80s, Austrian wine is considered to be of some of the highest quality in the world, even though it did take 16 years for the export market to fully recover and reach pre-scandal levels. Now, I think about this event minimum like once or twice a week. It's such a weird niche piece of history that really never gets talked about, especially outside of Europe. And if you want a more in-depth explanation, go check out Down the Rabbit Hole's video on it on YouTube. It should be about 34 minutes long. And it was that video that actually introduced me to the event itself. So yeah, the 1985 Austrian wine poisonings. That's my Roman Empire.